so welcome to Chapter 2. We're picking up where we left off on Chapter 1. So please make sure that you have already listened to and taken notes from Chapter 1 before we start here with Colliding Cultures, Chapter 2. So when we last left off, we talked quite a bit about the Columbian Exchange, that exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between Old and New World. And we know that this transformed the Old and the New World. However, it transformed them pretty disparately, meaning very differently. So for the New World, pretty bad. Disease wiped out entire civilizations, and it brought about subjugation by the Europeans for the Native American groups. For the Old World, however, it was pretty positive. So, for example, not only are the financial backers of these colonies becoming wealthy, not only are governments becoming wealthy, but actually the average person is enriched by this. Some new crops are going to start pouring into Europe, mainly corn, potatoes, and tomatoes, though there are others. But these enrich the European diet and actually start lengthening the lifespan. So if you can imagine in Italy without tomatoes or in Ireland without potatoes, it did exist prior to 1492. After 1492, these crops slowly start making their way to Europe. And they're very nutritious. Think about a potato. I mean, you can eat the whole thing. There's a lot of nutrition in it. It fills you up. And so for the poor, it's a really good food source that they can plant, that they can really largely live off of. Because people at this time, of course, didn't really have access. If you were poor or even of average wealth, you didn't really have access to a lot of meat and to a lot of different types of food. So very important for them. So Spain, as we saw, they're the first to really explore and colonize the New World. However, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, and England all start to want in on what they see as being obviously very successful enterprise. And eventually Spain will lose their privileged position in the New World. But again, Spain is first, and they are technically the first Europeans to enter and start building European civilizations in what is today the United States. Spain is the first to colonize Florida. We'll talk about how we acquire Florida a little bit later on, but Florida was not one of the 13 original colonies. It was originally a Spanish possession. Juan Ponce de Leon enters Florida in 1513. A fortress is built at what was then and is now St. Augustine in 1565. And Spanish are the first Europeans to enter and start colonizing the present day. Part of the reason why it took them so long, if you think 1492, and it's going to take quite a bit of years for them to start moving into the United States, why it took them so long to really establish a lot of civilizations there is that the Spanish reluctantly concluded that the gold and silver of Mexico and Peru really didn't exist north of the Rio Grande. Of course, we know it does exist in California and other places, as we'll discover in the gold rush. But the places they were in, it didn't. And so there wasn't a whole lot of incentive early on to start going north. And so the expansion north is pretty slow, but eventually they do get there. They start establishing permanent settlements in present-day New Mexico. Again, New Mexico as a state did not exist because, of course, the United States as a political entity didn't exist. The land was there. We're talking about how we got there, but we're using it just to give you an idea of the geography of where we're talking about. And by 1630, there are 3,000 Spaniards living in that area. So not a whole lot, but a settlement nonetheless. Religion was used as an effective instrument for control amongst the Native Americans. It's a sad fact that it seems like religion the world round can be used in the wrong hands to really negative ends. And in this case, the missionaries, they were mainly of the Franciscan order, established missions to help impose Catholicism on the Native American groups. And they also used the encomienda system that we talked about in last chapter to exploit the native labor. And the Franciscan friars and the Spanish political officials forced the Pueblo Indians, which were in this region, to pay tribute and to work on the encomiendas and to convert to Christianity as well. They did not take to this very kindly. Eventually, there is going to be a large-scale revolt in 1680, the Pueblo Revolt. is where the rebel Native Americans killed over 400 Spanish settlers and destroyed all Catholic churches in the region. Now, it does achieve their end. It temporarily drives the Spanish out of this area. However, it was short-lived. By 1692, a mere 12 years later, the Spanish are effectively back in control of the American Southwest. And in doing so, they worked hard to create a mixed Indian and Spanish culture that was dominated by Spanish officials. So again, that's Spain. They are first to technically start being the first Europeans. Native Americans are already there, but the first Europeans to start settling in this region. Eventually, other people are going to come on this stage. Why Spain was able to get there so much earlier than others, there's really a lot of unrest going on in Europe. We know that the Portuguese are a strong, stable nation, but remember the Portuguese have their own water route to Asia, and so they're really not interested initially. When they start seeing all the new crops and things that are coming in, and we'll talk about them a little bit later on, they're eventually going to get interested. But in terms of everybody else, the two nations most capable of contesting Spain in the New World are England and France. And England and France at the time were really shaken by the Reformation. And if you don't know what the Reformation is, please go look that up on your own. Basically speaking, this is when groups start protesting against the Catholic Church's interpretation of Christianity. And that just rocks England and France, especially so. It leads to a series of very long and very expensive conflicts that drain the time, the resources, and the lives of the people of England and France. And eventually, over time, the violence does diminish, but the religious and political rivalries are going to continue, both within the country and between the countries themselves. So eventually things settle down in these countries and other nations as well. And as they do, reports of the Spanish atrocities that are going on in the New World start to spread. And so this leads to a humanitarian justification for European colonization. So, Spain, they're colonizing the New World, but they're so brutal, look at all these terrible things they're doing. We can do it so much better. We can bring about this benevolent colonization of the New World. And so that leads an additional incentive for other nations to get in on the game. Additionally, Spain has had some successful conquests in different countries, in France, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. And there's a lot of resentment towards Spain, and they want to break Spanish dominance, right? Like, they're the number one players in the late 1400s, early 1500s. They're the strongest nation. And so, of course, people are going to be resentful of them. And so people want to challenge their preeminence on the world stage. And again, English writers are going to urge this benevolent conquest. Well, not only do we want to get back at Spain, but we also think that we can somehow, do it better than them. So let's talk about the different groups that also start colonizing North America, as well as Central and South America and the Caribbean as well. So the French government starts to subsidize early exploration early on in the 16th century. If you don't know how centuries work, you go back one. So the 16th century talks about the 1500s. Mainly what they are focused on is finding the fabled Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage was this mythical waterway that supposedly ran through North America and led to the Pacific Ocean and Asia. It doesn't exist, but they of course didn't know that, and they thought, we should find that because if we control that waterway, hey, that's going to make us very powerful, just like the control of the Panama Canal is very lucrative and is very powerful because that is the man-made waterway, of course. There's no natural waterway. They believed that Canada's St. Lawrence River could be it. Again, it's not. They didn't know that. And so because of that, French colonial possessions center around the Great Lakes region. Later, they moved through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi to New Orleans, but that's going to happen later on. The map to the right shows you their early exploration. A lot of their colonization develops through investment from private trading companies. So sometimes some of these explorations were backed entirely by the government, and sometimes through private investors looking to turn a profit. Hey, I'll give you some money. You go and try to found a colony, grow some crops, trade for furs, and then I get a share of the profits. And so there are some private financial backers as well. Quebec is founded in 1608 by Samuel de Champlain, and it becomes a foothold for what will become New France. The focus for the French in terms of their colonization is really on the fur trade, and they differ a lot from the Spanish and later the English in that they really worked to cooperate with the Native Americans. Does that mean they did it perfectly and respectfully all the time? No, but they really wanted to work with them instead of against them and, sort of driving them out. Few really settled permanently. We'll talk more about this when we talk about like the French and Indian War. They mainly are there to engage in the fur trade, which was very profitable with the Native Americans, and they might do that and then go back home, but they're not living in like very large settled cities. Jesuit missionaries, again, very different from the Franciscan friars of the Southwest. They lived alongside Native Americans in an effort to convert them through a more peaceful means. And many French fur traders married native wives. Again, they're not coming over as families, which is going to differ from the Puritans, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so they end up marrying Native American wives. The government does try to stop that by sending over French women, essentially maybe what you might kind of call a mail order bride nowadays. They literally just send these women over to become wives to the settlers, but it still happened nonetheless. All right, tell you about the Dutch. So the Netherlands at the time was a very small maritime nation with great wealth. If you don't know where the Netherlands are, there's a picture to the right. You can see that they are bordered by the North Sea, and so hence they're a maritime nation. In 1581, they win their official independence from the powerful Habsburg family, which ruled not only the Holy Roman Empire, but also Spain as well. Very powerful family of which the famous Marie Antoinette was a part. And they had a reputation for being one of the freest European nations. So for some examples here, of course there's more, but just for example, Dutch women had separate legal identities as their husbands, which didn't exist anywhere else at the time. And they had a large amount of religious tolerance. So when the Pilgrims, which we'll talk about later on, get kicked out of England for their religious beliefs, they actually are going to come to the Netherlands initially before migrating to the New World. They're also very advanced capitalists. They had a lot of financial innovations, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, for instance, and the East India Trading Company. So in 1609, they start their own exploration of the New World. They commission an Englishman by the name of Henry Hudson to try to discover, again, that elusive Northwest Passage. Everyone's looking for it. Too bad it doesn't exist. So of course he fails. However, he does find the Hudson River and establish New Netherland, which will eventually become, as we know it today, New York. The Dutch also chartered the Dutch West India Trading Company in 1621 to establish colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and North America. The Dutch had some guidelines for their settlers that included those based on a legal philosopher at the time by the name of Hugo Grotius. And they believed that the natives had the same natural rights as Europeans. And so as a result, any land that they had must be purchased. You couldn't just take it from the Native Americans. So for example, in 1626, Peter Minuit bought, quote unquote, Manhattan from Native Americans. There's some controversy surrounding this. Did he pay a fair amount of money? Did he swindle them? You can look into that on your own if you want. But again, the idea that they felt that the land had to be purchased in the first place is at least somewhat of an improvement. So the Dutch start establishing farms through their patroon system. These were large estates that were given to wealthy landowners. The landowners would then pay for the passage of tenants to come and to work the land. However, this system failed to attract many people to migrate. Again, the Netherlands is a pretty wealthy nation. Not a lot of people see the benefit in migrating to a new world, giving everything up and coming to a land that they know nothing about. So in order to farm these large estates in 1626, 11 enslaved people arrived to build New Amsterdam, and these are enslaved individuals from Africa. There were a lot of fears that they would intermix with the Dutch, and so women started to be imported too, just like there were fears with the French intermarrying with the Native Americans. Same thing going on here. But by 1650, there are 500 African slaves living in Dutch colonies in North America. So again, We're going to be talking about slavery throughout and how it develops into the system of slavery as we tend to think of it in North America, the slavery of the South, the very codified, very strict racial divide between slaves and planters. This slavery, again, is less comprehensively exploitative than later American system of slavery. I wouldn't say it was good by any means. I wouldn't say any slavery is good by any means. But it's interesting to think about how the fact that the Dutch tout their personal liberties, but at the same time, they're still grappling with the reality of slavery as well. And in the end, the economic goals of their colonies really overshadowed any moral objections they might have to slavery. All right, moving on to the Portuguese. So eventually the Portuguese want to get in on this discovery of the New World as well. Again, they're a little bit later because they have their own water route to India and the rest of Asia, so they don't really need to. But when they realize that this is a whole new world, okay, now we want to get in on the game. So Spain and Portugal are really going to square off for the supremacy of South America. And there's a lot of fighting between the two of them until eventually the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divides South America. And you can see the line over there to the right. Spain got everything to the west of the line, Portugal to the east. Clearly, Spain got the much better deal. Portugal basically got Brazil, modern day Brazil, and nothing else. Now, the reason for this is because the Pope at the time is the one who negotiated the treaty, and the Pope was Spanish, a very corrupt man by the name of Rodrigo Borgia. And he was Spanish, and they promised a Spanish princess for one of his sons. Yes, he had sons illegitimately, and so they got the better end of the bargain here. And in exchange for the Pope negotiating this treaty, he wanted the Spanish and the Portuguese to treat the natives with Christian compassion, which we noted. So again, the Portuguese are a little bit slow to really get going in terms of their colonial possessions, even after the Treaty of Tordesillas. Their colonies in Africa and India initially are the ones receiving the most attention from them. But by 1530, they're really looking to focus in more on Brazil. And initially, they focus on the gold and silver mines of the region. But eventually, the most dominant industries come to be the sugar and the slave trade. As a matter of fact, there were more African slaves enslaved in Brazil than any other colony in the New World. Jesuit missionaries are eventually going to bring Christianity to Brazil, but African and native elements really come into the mix so that there's a really unique religious culture in Brazil. And again, there are more African slaves in Brazil than any other colony. This is because there was a high slave mortality, especially in this area. And so they always needed the steady influx of slaves. And so as a result, there's a strong cultural connection between Africa and Brazil. All right, getting into the English colonization of North America. Hopefully you know that the 13 colonies were a British colony before winning independence and establishing the United States of America. So how did that all get started? We haven't talked about the English yet. Well, by the time the English get in on the game, Spain has a 100-year head start on the English. Remember, the Protestant Reformation really shook England and delayed a whole lot of things. And this is going to continue until Elizabeth I comes to the throne in 1588 and brings about this sort of golden age of British history. So this is the age of Shakespeare, and this is where they really start evolving as a nation and where they're going to start expanding their trade. They engage in a concept known as mercantilism. This is state-assisted manufacturing and trading system designed to create and maintain markets and to stimulate economic growth. While all this is going on, there's a tremendous amount of social and economic changes that are unsettling the population. There's a big population increase from 3 million in 1500 to 5 million in the mid-1600s. That's a pretty big jump in a very short amount of time. And at the same time, and because of this, the cost of land is going up. So even though the cost of land is going up, the income that farmers are able to get from their crops is going down. So they can't buy any more land because their income has gone down. Rents and prices are also going up, but wages are staying the same. So if your rent and the prices of foods and other goods you might need are going up, but your wages aren't going up as well to compensate, that's a problem for you. And on top of it all, landowners start to enclose public lands. There's this shift in England and a focus from growing a lot of crops to livestock among wealthy landowners. And so these public lands, which were held in common by the people of a town, where, you know, they'd go and they'd let their sheep, or let's say you have one cow that you use to give you milk and whatnot, you'd kind of let your cow go and graze over there. Well, now all of a sudden landowners are saying, no, this is my land, and they're closing it off to the public. So as a result, tenants are being evicted from their land. People can't afford their farms. People can't afford average everyday things they need to survive. And as you can imagine, this leads to just hordes of these landless, jobless peasants. So much so that estimates are up to a quarter to maybe even a half of the entire population lived in extreme poverty in England. So that's going to be important to remember later on when we start talking about indentured servants. However, to establish an overseas colony, you need a lot of money or capital. You need somebody to give you money to get this whole civilization off the ground. And so the idea of the joint stock company comes into play, designed to maximize profits and minimize risks for investors. So it's basically like the modern day stock market. You invest in this overseas colony, this joint stock company that's going to fund this colony, and any profit the colony turns, you get a share in proportion to how much you invested. So 5 people invest, obviously they'd probably need more than that, but 5 people invest. You invest in a quarter of it, and you are going to receive a quarter of the profits. And if you lose out, then you lose a quarter of that investment. So again, it's basically an early version of the modern day stock market. And they're going to fund these early colonies that we talk about. So English colonization is going to be different from the colonization we talked about before. And we can see kind of early evidence of how they are going to be by looking at the efforts of England to conquer Catholic Ireland. Rather than integrate or convert with the Irish population, English landowners are going to seize land through violence and push out the inhabitants. And this is basically going to be the same strategy deployed in America. So the first English settlement happens in 1587 at a place called Roanoke in North Carolina, and it fails. So they establish this colony. Their leader goes back, supposed to come back right away with some more supply ships. And of course, right away is a relative term because it took weeks and months to get across the Atlantic Ocean at the time. However, the supply ships don't appear for a number of reasons for years. When they do finally get back to Roanoke, there's no one there. There's no sign of the colony. Everyone's gone. The only evidence they see are the word Croatoan on a tree. So historians have speculated as to what happened to Roanoke. You can go down that rabbit hole if you want to look more into it. What most likely happened is a majority of them died out due to starvation and disease, and those that survived went and joined the neighboring Croatoan Native American tribe. That's probably what happened, but there's all sorts of theories. So they try again, and they establish another colony. This one is called Jamestown in present-day Virginia. Now, again, I say Roanoke in North Carolina. Of course, North Carolina as a colony and or a state does not exist yet. Again, I'm using this just to give you reference. Jamestown is going to be the first permanent English settlement in 1607, again in modern-day Virginia. It was backed by profit seekers, backed by investors. The colonists who are going to initially establish Jamestown are mostly gentlemen. So these are not farmers out there farming their own land. These are gentlemen who don't actually work with their hands, and as a result, not prepared for the challenges of establishing a colony from nothing. The land also that they chose was pretty poor. It was not the particular plot of land that they picked. There's Native Americans in the region, but not on that plot of land. There weren't Native Americans on that plot of land for a reason, because the land was very poor. So they had a hard time growing crops, and as a result, disease and starvation is going to set in. Things will eventually even out when the famous John Smith takes command. By the way, the whole John Smith being saved by Pocahontas is probably a fabrication on his part and probably never happened. They did not have a love affair like the Disney movie suggests. Pocahontas was a young girl when John Smith was in Jamestown, so not a thing. So again, they do establish a colony. They establish Jamestown in the midst of the Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan. He led about 10,000 Algonquin-speaking people in this loose confederation. And initially, they have pretty good relations with the Jamestown community. They, in fact, are the ones to keep the English alive in that first very harsh winter. But eventually relations will deteriorate and starvation becomes extreme when the Native Americans stop helping them because they don't know what they're doing. Again, not only are they in a new place, they are made up of people who really have no experience of hard work and don't know what they're doing. They don't know much about the land. And starvation becomes so extreme that we have evidence that cannibalism was taking place. So really bad. What eventually does save the Jamestown colony is tobacco. Tobacco changes everything. The first tobacco plant was planted by the name of John Rolfe. Fun fact, Pocahontas' actual husband is this guy, John Rolfe. In 1616, he plants the first tobacco crop. And it's hugely successful. It basically saves the Jamestown colony because it makes the Jamestown colony profitable. Tobacco was what we call a cash crop, meaning it's a crop you could grow and earn a whole lot of cash for. That's really all it means. Because in this case, it's highly addictive, and people want it when they're addicted to it, and so they're willing to pay a lot of money for it. Within 15 years of that first tobacco crop being planted, the Jamestown colony is exporting 5,000 pounds per year. Within 40 years, all of the British colonies in North America are exporting about 15 million pounds of tobacco per year. And so because Jamestown has been able to prove to be profitable due to tobacco, this incentivizes further colonization by the British of North America. So tobacco is a cash crop. However, it's very labor intensive at the time. Without modern agricultural machinery, it was very difficult to grow. You as an individual would have a hard time just growing a large tobacco concern on your own. So between 1607 and 1676, the chief source of agricultural labor in the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and later Maryland, which was established as a colony for Catholics, were indentured servants. So indentured servants are, in this case, English people who, seeking to improve their lives, enter into contracts called indentured. So you would bond yourself to an employer for a period of years in exchange for passage. So essentially what you're doing here is selling yourself into slavery in exchange for your passage being paid to come to the British colonies. So why would somebody do this? Well, think back to that slide before when I was talking about conditions for poor people in England. There's really not a whole lot for you there. You have just these hordes of poor people who, what are you going to do? You can't really better yourself. The price of land is going up. Wages are staying the same. People are being driven off of what land they might have been farming. And so you as an individual or you as a family, what future is there for you by remaining in England if you're poor? It's not a whole lot. So just hundreds and hundreds of people willingly, as you can see from this indenture over here on the right, the wording is of his or her own will and accord. You are selling yourself into what is essentially slavery. Now, it's slavery for a time period. It's not for all of your life. But still, you are indenturing yourself to be a slave, meaning working without pay for this person in the hope that when you're done, you will be able to become a planter yourself and thus better your future. So this is how a vast majority of people actually came to the colonies in terms of English men and women. They came as indentured servants. So if you know you have family that was here that long, chances are you have somebody in your past who was an indentured servant. It's just the way it was. And this was incentivized by the head right system. So the landowner themselves received 50 acres for each person they brought over as an indenture. So not only are you getting free labor out of these people, you're also getting more land out of bringing more people because, of course, the colonies want more people to come and live and establish themselves so that they can grow as a profitable colony. But despite all this, of course, you lived in very difficult conditions. You are a slave to these people. You're not treated well by any means. If you're a female indentured servant, you can't marry until your term of service is up. And your rights are, of course, severely restricted. But people, again, it shows the depth of their misery, that they were willing to do this all in the hope of a better future. So indentured servants exist alongside with slavery. So again, we're going to continue to talk about slavery as the slow evolution into the system in which we identify as slavery in America. And so I start off this slide by talking about the House of Burgesses, and there's a reason for that, which I'll explain in a minute. So the increased population of the Virginia colony leads to the establishment of the House of Burgesses in 1619 in Jamestown. This was a limited representative body of landowning Jamestown residents, which would make decisions for Jamestown. So it's the first real example of representative government in the New World by the British. And it's interesting because 1619 is actually the same year that the first African slaves are sold in Virginia as well. So at the same time that you're establishing this concept of government by the people for the people, you're also having slaves. African slaves in this instance sold in Virginia. And again, of course, they already had indentured servants as well. So it's interesting that it just so happened to happen in the same year. So slowly over time, Europeans begin to see themselves as a separate race from Africans. Biologically speaking, there's no such thing as like biological. There are cultural differences, but there's only Homo sapiens. I mean, there were initially other groups of humans, hominids as they're called. They all died out, and Homo sapiens were the only ones left. And of course, culturally, people, depending on where you're from, you might be culturally different. And depending on where early humans settled, appearances changed. The further north people went, when the first humans left Africa, because all human life began in Africa, the further north they went, the lighter in complexion they became, all the better to absorb the vitamin D from the sun. And the further south you were, the closer to the equator, the darker your hair and skin came to protect yourself from the harmful rays of the sun. But Europeans start to see themselves as in some way distinct from Africans. And so as a result, there's this whole idea of preventing racial mixing. Now, early on, the ideas of race and the idea and the practice of slavery is not codified. So eventually, African slaves will serve for life, and their children are slaves, and so on and so forth. That's going to happen eventually. But early on, the African slaves that first are initially brought into the colonies also worked for a set number of years and eventually could become landowners themselves in the same way that indentured servants could. An example of that is Anthony Johnson, who himself became a wealthy landowner after he was a slave that was imported from the African nation of Angola. So again, the type of slavery that we associate with America happens slowly over time. And one of the reasons why it really changes is because of Bacon's Rebellion. So Bacon's Rebellion happens in 1676 in Virginia. A man by the name of Nathaniel Bacon led a group of small farmers, sometimes referred to as yeomen, who opposed the governor of Virginia, the colony of Virginia at the time, Governor Berkeley, because they felt that he favored the wealthy planters. No big surprise there. They were pretty successful. They were able to burn the entirety of Jamestown, but Bacon, at the same time as they were becoming successful, actually died of dysentery. Seems like everybody died of dysentery at the time, and if they didn't, they died of smallpox or TB. But he died of dysentery, and as a result, they lost their leader and the rebellion ended. And so this is important for a couple reasons. Number one, it shows the tensions between the poor former indentured servants. Bacon was a former indentured servant. The people that he led were former indentured servants, and the wealthy landowners. More significantly is that it encouraged the planters, the wealthy planters, to view the indentured servants as troublesome. And as a result, start to slowly replace them more and more with slaves from Africa. So again, we're seeing the slow evolution of slavery. Initially, indentured servants and slaves serving side by side in temporary conditions of servitude. Slowly over time, indentured servants kind of fall out of favor. It takes a while, but starting with Bacon's Rebellion, it becomes less common. And eventually it's going to be replaced exclusively with slaves from Africa who are going to be serving for their lifetime and their children's lifetime and so on and so forth. But again, that wasn't initially the case. And I also want to mention the Stono Rebellion, even though this happened considerably later in 1739 in South Carolina, but also to mention that there were slave uprisings as well, and to use this as an example. So in this rebellion, 20 enslaved Africans rose up and killed between 22 and 25 whites and burned the plantations of South Carolina. They were eventually suppressed by the local militia, and in response to this uprising, South Carolina and other colonies will follow suit as well, start to enact these strict laws against slaves. And again, it's another step in this codification of what slavery is in the South. So for instance, slaves couldn't assemble in groups without a white person present. They couldn't earn any additional money on the side or learn how to read. All right, switching gears from talking about what will eventually become the American South and talking about New England. And of course, New England is famously settled by the Puritans. So what's a Puritan? Well, the English church, which is called the Anglican Church, is a Protestant church. It's not Catholic. Henry VIII very famously broke away from the Catholic Church because they refused to grant him a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, a daughter of the famous Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. And that's a whole story in and of itself. It's an interesting one. Look into it if you want. But in any case, so he breaks away from the Catholic Church, not because he disagrees with the Catholic Church, but because they won't give him what he wants. And so the Anglican Church is very similar to the Catholic Church in terms of its practices, its church hierarchy, etc. Some people like this, some people don't. Some people want to return England to be a Catholic nation. Some people want it to be the complete opposite, and they want to purify, as they see it, the Anglican Church to make it more simple, more streamlined. These people are called Puritans. Some remain within the church, hoping to bring this about by remaining Anglicans. Some completely leave, and they're referred to as separatists. The Pilgrims, who are going to be the first of the Puritans to come to the New World, are a small group of separatists who want to sever all ties with the Anglican Church, completely leave it, and not just completely leave the Anglican Church, but eventually completely leave England altogether. They first settle in the Netherlands. When they're kicked out of England for being too troublesome, they continue to make trouble for the English king in the Netherlands, and so they're eventually sent to the New World, where they settle very famously in Plymouth, what will eventually be Massachusetts. They, of course, sail on the Mayflower, but without a royal charter. And so in order to ensure an orderly government, the 41 men aboard the Mayflower signed the famous Mayflower Compact, in which they agreed to combine themselves together in a civil body politic and to make decisions based on the will of the people. So even from our very beginnings as a nation, before we were a nation, when we were just a colony, we had this precedence of self-government, government for the people, by the people. Evidence in the Mayflower Compact, evidenced in the House of Burgesses, and some other things that we're going to be talking about later on. So more Puritan groups eventually will follow the Pilgrims. Plymouth is eventually going to be incorporated in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is started when in 1630, a man by the name of John Winthrop leads 11 ships carrying 700 Puritans to New England. Puritans also went to other colonies, but a whole lot of them came to what will become the Massachusetts Bay Colony in New England, hoping to escape the persecution back home and the religious conformity that was demanded of them, and to be able to practice what they see as the preferred form of Christianity in the New World. And for the government's perspective, it's great. They get these troublesome people out of their hair. So again, they found the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which eventually incorporates Plymouth, the Pilgrim Colony. The Pilgrims, of course, are Puritans as well. They were just there earlier. And aboard the flagship of this fleet, the Arabella, John Winthrop, their leader, preaches this extremely famous sermon called City Upon a Hill. So this is the most famous excerpt. This is the most famous part of it. He says, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all the people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we shall have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." Okay, so why is this sermon so important? Well, number one, it expresses the belief that the Puritans have a special pact with God. They are in some way favored by God, and that they are supposed to build a model Christian society. This also inspires some reforms in England, but more importantly, for our purposes here, our study of American history, it's the first example of what we as historians have called American exceptionalism, which is this belief that America has a mission to be this beacon of reform. Like, we're supposed to be special, right? Exceptionalism, American exceptionalism. We are exceptional in the world. The eyes of the world are all upon us. We're the ones setting the model for everybody else. And this is an idea you're going to see again and again and again, but it starts with John Winthrop and the Puritans. So what were some of Puritans' beliefs? Well, the Puritans were Calvinists in that they believed that men and women were sinful by nature, and that only a few, called the elect, will be saved by God's grace. And this belief is known as predestination. So not everybody is going to heaven, only the elect will be going to heaven, and those people have already been chosen by God. They also had a very strong work ethic. They are the ones who start the term idle hand, or the phrase, I should say, idle hands are the devil's workshop, meaning you should always be doing something, always be working, lest the devil get you. They also wanted to seek a more direct approach to God. So they renounced the rituals and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church and the Catholic Mass. The Puritan congregation was purely through self-government. They didn't have that hierarchy of priests and bishops and cardinals. And the members of the Puritan church were limited to those people who they called visible saints. Those are the people who could prove that they knew that they were saved. Puritans are also different from a lot of the other colonies we've talked about so far in that they migrated together as families. And they made these compact little villages in which their meeting house was the center, where they would hold their worship services, and it was also a town hall. It's like a church/town hall all in one. And there is, over there on the right, a recreation of the meeting house in the very famous Salem, where the famous Salem witch trials occurred, which was a Puritan settlement as well. They are a patriarchal society, meaning women had very little rights. They were subjugated to men. They also valued education, though, as a means to read and understand the Bible. It was part of their faith and belief system that everybody should be able to and should read the Bible, because, again, they're looking for direct communication with God. And this is something that at the time the Catholic Church did not allow. And anyway, the Catholic Church used the Latin Bible, which a vast majority of people couldn't read Latin. And so because of that, a village that had 50 or more people needed a teacher. If you had less than 50, you would be expected to be taught to read at home by your parents, usually your mother. And Harvard, the first college of the United States, was founded in order to train ministers within the Puritan community. They believed strongly that the church and state should be closely bound together, pretty much the opposite of what the United States has written in our Constitution today. And they also practiced a very strict code of moral conduct. So, for example, the theater was banned in New England. Dancing was banned. Those kinds of things were viewed as being sinful. The Puritans also strongly believed in religious conformity. It's one of the ironies that the Puritans who fled England due to their own persecution would then refuse to allow any kind of people who disagreed with them themselves. So two people who did disagree and were dissenters within the Puritan colony were Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Roger Williams disagreed with the fact that the church and the state, and by state I mean the government, he disagreed with the fact that they were so closely linked together. He felt that there should be a cleaner separation, such as we have in the United States today, where we don't have an official religion and you're allowed to practice whatever religion you want so long as your practices don't violate the law. He also wanted more religious freedom within the Puritan community, and for these beliefs he was banished, and he himself actually founded his own colony. The colony of Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams after he was banished from the Puritan community. Anne Hutchinson was a woman who claimed that she had revelations directly from God, and because of these revelations, she questioned the role of women in Puritan society, and for that belief, she was banished to Rhode Island, and later herself moved to what will eventually become Long Island, where she was unfortunately killed by Native Americans. Eventually, over time, the Puritans become more prosperous and less religious, and fewer adults could prove their own election, their members of their being visible saints. And so this allows the passage of the halfway covenant, which allowed baptism of children whose parents could not prove their own election. And so this is a kind of watering down of their very strict faith over time. Now, the Puritans also did not settle in a land that was uninhabited. There were 100,000 Native Americans living in the New England region. And initially, as was the case with the Jamestown community, they were very helpful. They taught the Puritans agriculture in exchange for furs and manufactured goods. But eventually, smallpox, again, those diseases brought by the English to the Native Americans, really decimated the population. And over time, the survivors turned against them when they realized they are going to keep expanding, they are going to keep encroaching on native land, and they, of course, were resentful of this. So Prince Metacom, who was known as King Philip, started what is known as King Philip's War, in which he attacked and burned the Puritan settlements. But eventually, the colonists are able to kill Metacom and defeat his followers in an act that is going to be repeated throughout colonial history, the subjugation of Native American groups. So that leads to our second chapter question for the week. In what ways do the Puritan ideals and way of life continue to influence American life today? So please do respond to that on our discussion board as well. And that is the end of chapter 2.